Her feet dangled above the grass, her terrified cries echoing down the cul-de-sac. I remember the metallic creak of the rope straining against the branch, the sound of neighbors' shutters clicking as blinds shifted. And I remember Marlene, the HOA president, leaning on her porch rail with folded arms, her pearl necklace catching the light as if this was nothing more than a community theater production she had directed. You can imagine what that moment did to me. Every muscle in my body fired at once, adrenaline burning hotter than any summer afternoon. My daughter's sneakers twisted mid-air, her voice breaking with panic, and I swear I could feel every second tattooing itself into my memory. This wasn't just a violation of decency. It was a declaration of war. And in that instant, I knew the fight had already gone too far. You might be asking yourself, how could something like this possibly happen under the watch of a neighborhood association that's supposed to preserve property values? How could bylaws about landscaping lead to a child being strung up like a scarecrow? That's what I want you to understand. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't random. This was the climax of months of silent battles, letters slid under doors, and threats wrapped in the polite tone of official correspondence. The rope wasn't just rope. It was the end of a fuse that had been burning for weeks. 3 weeks earlier, it had all seemed manageable. Back then, I thought my biggest concern was the paint color on my shutters. Marlene had sent me the first of what would become a relentless stream of violation notices. Section 8.2 of the covenants requires all exterior paint colors to be pre-approved, the letter read, bolded in that officious HOA font, the kind that makes you feel like you're already guilty. My shutters were slate blue, hardly offensive, but she argued they were not in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. Never mind that 3 houses down, the Wilkersons had bright red shutters that looked like a barn door. I walked into the HOA office that same afternoon, letter in hand. The space was exactly as sterile as you'd imagine. Beige carpet squares, buzzing fluorescent lights, the faint smell of copy toner. Behind the desk sat Marlene, every hair of her platinum bob in place, tapping her pen against a thick binder of bylaws. She smiled without warmth. "You're here about the notice?" she asked, as though she'd been waiting for me. I explained calmly, maybe too calmly, that my shutters had been professionally painted and matched the approved palette. She flipped through the binder theatrically, then tapped a page with a manicured nail. "We have final discretion. It's about uniformity. You understand." Her voice was syrupy, but underneath it I heard the steel. When I pushed back, she leaned forward just enough to let me know resistance was pointless. "You can appeal, but the board votes with me." That was the first time I realized this wasn't about paint. It was about control, and she wielded those bylaws like a weapon. Over the next week, the notices multiplied. Grass height, trash bins left visible, a garden gnome that detracted from community standards. Each fine stacked up like bricks in a wall she was building between me and any sense of normalcy. My neighbors whispered apologies when we crossed paths on the sidewalk, but none of them intervened. Fear has a way of silencing people. Everyone knew Marlene had sued the Millers over a non-conforming mailbox last year, draining their savings until they moved out. The real fracture line came on a Saturday morning. My daughter, only 10 years old, had set up a lemonade stand at the corner. Cardboard table, paper cups, hand-drawn sign, and bubble letters. The sun was bright, and she was smiling in that way kids do when they feel proud of something small. That's when Marlene appeared, pearls swinging like a pendulum as she marched across the grass. "This is an unauthorized commercial activity," she announced, loud enough for neighbors on both sides to hear. My daughter froze, plastic pitcher trembling in her hands. I stepped in immediately, asking Marlene what the harm was. "Section 11.4, she snapped. "No commercial use of lots." She toppled the table with one swift motion, lemonade spilling across the pavement. My daughter's face crumpled, her lip quivering. And right then, something inside me shifted. Tell me, wouldn't you snap too, seeing your child humiliated over a $5 lemonade stand? That moment wasn't just petty tyranny, it was the moment she made it personal. From then on, every encounter carried venom. Letters arrived with faster frequency, a fine for a bicycle left in the driveway overnight, a warning about improper seasonal decor because my daughter's chalk drawing remained on the sidewalk too long. I started documenting everything, saving each notice, photographing every absurd violation, because deep down I sensed this was building toward something bigger, and I would need proof. 2 weeks later came the incident with the fence. I'd built a modest 6-foot wooden privacy fence along the backyard, approved by the city, properly permitted. But at 6 in the morning, the grinding sound of power tools awoke me. A crew of contractors was dismantling it, posts ripped from the soil. I stormed outside barefoot, shouting over the whine of saws. Marlene stood at the edge of the yard, clipboard in hand, smirking as if she was hosting a demolition derby. "Non-conforming structure," she declared. My voice cracked as I reminded her that the permit was valid. She waved her pen like a scepter. "The HOA supersedes city codes." That was a lie, of course. HOAs cannot override municipal codes. But in the moment, surrounded by her hired muscle, I felt powerless. The smell of splintered cedar filled the morning air. My fence, my property, was reduced to rubble while neighbors peeked through curtains. No one lifted a finger. The fury boiled inside me, but I played it smart. I collected the broken boards, photographed the damage, and filed a police report. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly familiar with Marlene's antics, but shrugged. "It's a civil matter. Take it up with the HOA board." That was her genius. She operated in the gray zones of civil enforcement, always just shy of criminal, always insulated by bureaucracy. The day of the rope came fast after that. My daughter had been playing in the yard when Marlene confronted her again. Something about trespassing onto the easement, though she hadn't stepped a foot past our property line. Minutes later, I heard my daughter screaming. I ran outside, and there she was, tangled in rope that Marlene had strung under the guise of decorative lighting, hung across the branches like a trap. My daughter's hands clawed at the cord as her feet lifted from the grass. Neighbors stood frozen. Phones came out, recording, but no one moved to intervene. And Marlene? She leaned against her porch post, pearls glinting, watching like a queen surveying her spectacle. I cut my daughter down myself, my hands shaking, rope burns marking her arms. My fury was volcanic, but Marlene simply said, "You should control your child. Safety hazard." Then she turned, walking back into her house as if nothing had happened. And that's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just a battle over property values. It was a campaign of dominance. One woman's obsession with absolute control and a neighborhood too cowed to resist. I looked around at the faces in the windows, the blinds shutting shut, the silence that followed. Everyone knew she had gone too far. But still, no one spoke. What they didn't know was that I had already begun my counterplan. The documentation, the reports, the quiet calls I had made, those wheels were already turning. Marlene had crossed the line, and for the first time she had done it in front of witnesses. The helicopters hadn't arrived yet. That sound was still weeks away.
But the rope in my hands that day, rough and frayed, told me everything. This was no longer about bylaws. This was about survival in the suburb Marlene thought she owned. And the day she hung my daughter on that tree was the day she gave me all the ammunition I needed. The only question left was how far was I willing to go to bring her down.
The first thing I saw that morning was the color. Neon orange, burning against the beige of my front door like a hazard flare. The edges curled with dew, but the word violation screamed in block letters across the top. My heart sank, not because of the fine, though there would be one, but because of what it meant. Marlene had decided to make me the morning's example. The sprinklers hissed in the distance, their arcs crossing over emerald lawns, droplets catching the pale dawn light like glass shards. You ever notice how quiet a neighborhood feels at that hour? It's not peaceful. It's staged, artificial. And in Maplewood, it wasn't the sound of birds that woke you, but the slap of another notice taped to someone's garage. That was Marlene's orchestra, and she conducted it with military precision. Neighbors avoided eye contact as they fetched their newspapers, glancing at the glowing paper glued to my door like it might be contagious. I tore it free, fingers trembling, and read the accusation. Non-compliant trash receptacle placement. Section 12.3 of the HOA covenants. Fine, $100. Trash cans. That was the great crime of the day. I had rolled mine back from the curb at 9 p.m. instead of the required 8 p.m. By Marlene's clock, that was enough to brand me a criminal. You might laugh at that, but in Maplewood, these notices weren't just scraps of paper. They were public shaming devices. They were how Marlene reminded the neighborhood who held the leash. And if you didn't pay the fine, she could stack late fees until they ballooned, file a lien against your home, even drag you into court. Yes, over trash cans. 3 weeks earlier, when we first moved into Maplewood, I thought the HOA was just a formality. A monthly fee, a committee that occasionally hosted block parties, maybe a newsletter about lost cats. But within days, I learned that Marlene ran the board like a warden ran a prison camp. There was no democracy, no neighbors looking out for each other. There was only Marlene's interpretation of the covenants, and her interpretation never favored anyone but herself. The first neighborhood meeting I attended proved that. Picture a beige community hall with folding chairs, a plastic American flag in the corner, and a long table draped in polyester where Marlene and her board sat like royalty. I sat in the back, curious, maybe even hopeful. The agenda was supposed to be about landscaping budgets and pool maintenance. Instead, it turned into a tribunal. A man named Dennis was called out first. His crime? Failing to edge his lawn to the HOA standard. Marlene read his violation letter aloud, then asked the board for a vote. They nodded obediently like bobbleheads on a dashboard. Dennis tried to defend himself, explaining his mower had broken down. Marlene cut him off mid-sentence. "Excuses don't change the bylaws," she said, pearls gleaming under the fluorescent light. The motion carried. Dennis owed $150. His wife sat rigid beside him, staring at the floor. Do you see the pattern yet? This wasn't governance. It was theater, a show of dominance, performed monthly, designed to keep the rest of us compliant. And every gasp, every bowed head, every check written afterward was fuel for Marlene's empire. Back in my kitchen that morning, I slapped the orange notice onto the counter and stared at it over coffee. My wife whispered, "Just pay it." But I couldn't, because it wasn't about $100. It was about surrendering. Once you pay, you validate her game. And once you validate it, you're trapped. That afternoon, I called the HOA office. Marlene answered herself, which surprised me. "Maplewood Association, this is Marlene," she said, voice dripping with false cheer.
"It's about the violation on my door," I began, keeping my tone calm. "The trash cans. I had them in by 9. The bylaw says promptly. That's subjective." There was a pause, the kind that tells you someone is smiling on the other end. "Promptly means by 8, she said. "Where does it say that?" "In the board's interpretation." Interpretation. That was her weapon of choice. Nothing was written in stone unless she decided it was, and if you pressed her, she had a stack of vague clauses and board discretion phrases to back her up. I told her I would appeal. She chuckled softly. "You're welcome to. The board votes with me." Click. That was when the walls of Maplewood began to close in. The neighborhood wasn't just manicured, it was policed. Driveways scrubbed clean of oil stains, mailboxes painted in uniform eggshell white, lawns trimmed with the precision of a military parade. From the outside it looked idyllic, but from the inside it was suffocating. You could smell the fertilizer in the air, sharp and artificial, a constant reminder that nature here was curated, not lived. The next violation came 2 days later. Improper lawn ornament. My daughter had left a pink flamingo in the yard as a joke. Fine, $50. The day after that, sidewalk chalk drawings, prohibited defacement. Fine, $75. Every infraction was another brick in the wall, another step toward the inevitable confrontation. One evening, I confronted Marlene in person. She was inspecting mailboxes with a clipboard, jotting notes like a general reviewing troops. I walked up, flamingo in hand, and said, "This is what you fined me for." Her eyes narrowed, lips tightening. "Standards are what keep property values high," she replied. "Standards or control," I shot back. The silence between us stretched. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, but recognition. She knew I wasn't going to roll over. And that, more than any flamingo, was my real violation. The neighbors watched from porches, eyes darting between us like spectators at a boxing match. No one spoke. No one ever did. Because in Maplewood, you didn't challenge the warden. Not unless you were prepared to face the consequences. The board meeting that followed proved that point. My appeal over the trash can fine was heard, if you can call it that. I presented my case, documents in hand. Marlene leaned back, letting me speak, then glanced at her loyalists, all in favor of upholding the violation. Every hand raised. Every single one. The decision took less than 10 seconds. When the gavel struck, something inside me crystallized. I wasn't just fighting about trash cans anymore. I was fighting about the right to breathe in my own home without being strangled by a rule book. I looked around the room. The bowed heads, the neighbors too cowed to meet my eyes, and I realized they were prisoners too. They just didn't admit it. Walking out of that meeting, the night air felt heavier. Porch lights glowed like surveillance cameras. The sidewalks were too clean, the houses too perfect, the silence too sharp. Maplewood wasn't a neighborhood. It was a prison camp, disguised with white picket fences and welcome mats. And Marlene was the warden, Pearl swinging like keys at her belt. I knew then she wouldn't stop. The notices would keep coming, the fines would keep stacking, and eventually she would drive me out like she'd driven out the Millers and the Robinsons before me, unless I found a way to beat her at her own game. But the question was how. How do you fight someone who controls the rule book, the board, and the silence of every neighbor around you?
The crash of lumber hitting the grass jolted me awake. By the time I stumbled outside, barefoot and half-dressed, a demolition crew in neon vests was already dismantling my brand-new privacy fence, plank by plank. Marlene stood at the curb like a general at war, clipboard clutched in her hand, pearl earrings gleaming in the early morning sun. Her voice carried over the mechanical hum of drills and the rhythmic thud of hammers. "This fence violates Section 7.3 of Maplewood's Architectural Guidelines," she barked, as if reading a death sentence. My fence wasn't even 2 weeks old. You could hear the splinters crack, each board snapping like a bone. The crew worked with mechanical precision, their eyes avoiding mine as if my outrage were invisible. Neighbors lingered at their windows. I saw blinds twitch, the faint silhouette of mugs raised to lips, the soft glow of kitchen lights. Nobody came outside. Nobody spoke up. Just me, barefoot on my lawn, helpless as my money, my labor, was ripped from the earth. Do you know that feeling when rage is so sharp it almost tastes metallic? That's what burned in my mouth as Marlene crossed her arms and smirked at me. She had waited for this, planned it, and in that moment I realized Maplewood wasn't a neighborhood, it was a stage. Marlene wrote the script, directed the scenes, and the rest of us, we were just extras. Now let's rewind, because this didn't come out of nowhere. 3 weeks earlier, I filed the paperwork. Maplewood HOA bylaws required an architectural change request form for any exterior modification. I read the manual twice before filling it out. I measured the posts, listed the height, 6 feet exactly, no more, no less, and attached photos of similar fences already built 2 streets over. I even paid the $50 non-refundable application fee. That's the kind of detail they buried you with in Maplewood. Fees for forms, forms for fees, and a labyrinth of approvals that could drag on for months. But here's the kicker. According to state HOA statutes, if the board doesn't respond within 30 days, the application is deemed approved by default. It's a clause designed to protect homeowners from boards that deliberately stall. 30 days came and went. No letter, no email, no denial. I thought I'd played it safe, so I hired a local contractor and installed my fence. Simple, clean cedar planks with a natural finish. Nothing garish, nothing out of place. Marlene must have been biding her time, waiting for me to think I'd won. That morning, as the fence came down, I shouted, "You can't do this without a hearing!" My voice cracked with equal parts fury and disbelief. The HOA charter was clear. Fines or enforcement actions required a written notice, followed by an opportunity to contest. Due process, even if warped, was still required. Marlene turned, that shark smile spreading across her face. "The board voted last night, unanimous decision. Consider this enforcement." I remember her exact words because they weren't true. I checked later. There hadn't even been a board meeting. It was Marlene acting unilaterally, using the HOA letterhead like a weapon. She waved a folded paper at me, bright orange ink stamped across the top. "Violation notice. Immediate action required." She must have printed it herself. The crew tossed another section of my fence into the back of their truck. I stepped forward, blocking their path. One of them, a young guy with a buzz cut, looked at me with pity. "Sir, we're just hired to do the work. You'll have to take it up with her." He jerked his thumb toward Marlene. I wanted to scream, to physically stop them, but the truth was she had boxed me in. If I laid a finger on those contractors, she could call it assault. If I refused to comply, she'd fine me $100 a day, and Maplewood bylaws gave her the power to attach those fines as liens against my home. That's the nuclear option most people don't realize HOAs have. They can legally force foreclosure over unpaid fines. Imagine losing your house over grass height or the wrong shade of mailbox paint. That's the kind of sword Marlene dangled over us. So I watched in silence, my fists clenched, as my fence disappeared into splinters. Later that day I confronted her in the office. Beige walls, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of burnt coffee in the corner. She sat behind a desk stacked with binders, each labeled with a year of Maplewood bylaws and amendments. Her nails clicked on the keyboard as I walked in. I bypassed procedure. She didn't even look up. Section 7.3 clearly states all fences must be pre-approved for material and design. Yours was not. It was deemed approved after 30 days, I countered.
Now she looked up, her eyes gleaming. "That only applies if the application is valid. Yours was incomplete." She slid my form across the desk. I scanned it, heart pounding. Sure enough, one box was left unchecked. Color finish sample attached. A clerical oversight, nothing more. But she wielded it like a smoking gun. "This neighborhood has standards. Standards that keep property values high. People like you think you can skirt the rules, but not under my watch." Do you hear the arrogance, the relish in her voice? That's when it hit me. This wasn't about fences or bylaws. It was about dominance. She needed me to kneel, to admit she was in charge. I walked out of that office, every step echoing like a drumbeat of humiliation. But humiliation has a way of hardening into resolve. That night, the neighborhood was quiet, except for the faint hiss of sprinklers and the rhythmic chirp of crickets. I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread out like a crime scene investigation, violation notices, application forms, state statutes printed off the county website. I wasn't just reading anymore. I was hunting, tracing her mistakes, mapping her abuses. And somewhere between the legal jargon and the HOA bylaws, a thought crystallized. Marlene had drawn first blood. The next morning, I made my first move. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no confrontation, just a single letter slipped into the HOA drop box. A request for records, my legal right under state law. By statute, the HOA was required to provide minutes of board meetings, financial records, and correspondence within 10 business days. If she claimed the board had voted, I wanted proof. And if there was no proof, then I'd caught her lying in black and white. It was a small act, almost invisible, but in a neighborhood where fear kept everyone silent, that letter was a spark. 2 days later, I caught my neighbor, Tom, by his mailbox. He looked both ways before whispering, "Saw what happened to your fence. Damn shame. She pulled the same stunt on the Johnsons last year with their shed. They just gave up." His eyes darted toward Marlene's house. "Don't tell her I said anything." The whispers were there, just beneath the surface. Everyone hated her, everyone feared her, and yet everyone complied. Not me, not anymore. The demolition of my fence wasn't the end. It was the opening salvo, a test of willpower, and while she thought she'd broken me, she had no idea she'd awakened something far more dangerous, a homeowner who was no longer afraid. As I stood on my stripped-down lawn staring at the empty posts where my fence once stood, I could almost hear her voice echoing in my head. This neighborhood has standards. But whose standards? And who had given her the right to twist them into chains? The answer, I realized, was coming. And when it did, it would
sound of
shake
plastic
Maplewood
cups
to
hitting
its
the
manicured
pavement was
core.
what broke me. I came outside to see my daughter's lemonade stand tipped over, sticky yellow liquid pooling in the cracks of the sidewalk. Marlene stood over it, clipboard in hand, her pearls glinting in the morning sun like they were mocking me. Section 5.2 of Maplewood prohibits unsanctioned commercial activity, she said flatly, as if reciting scripture. My daughter's eyes brimmed with tears as she tried to gather the coins scattered in the grass. That was the moment I stopped thinking of Marlene as just a nuisance. She had become something else entirely, a predator who had crossed into my family's life. The neighbors pretended not to see. One woman jogged by, earbuds in, refusing to glance our way. A man watering his roses froze, then turned his back. Have you ever felt an entire street silently conspire against you, choosing cowardice over conscience? That's how it felt. The silence wasn't just indifference, it was fear. I knelt beside my daughter, my hands sticky with lemonade as I righted the small wooden table. She sniffled, whispering, "She said I'm not allowed to sell here." I looked up at Marlene, who smirked like a cat that had cornered a bird. My voice shook, but it was steady enough. "She's 10 years old. This isn't a business. It's a kid selling lemonade." She tapped her clipboard.
Rules are rules. If I let this slide, what's next? Garage sales without permits? Food trucks in driveways? This neighborhood has standards. That phrase again. Her mantra. Standards. Always invoked, never defined. But let's rewind, because this wasn't spontaneous. This was the culmination of weeks of tension after the fence incident. Marlene had escalated in small ways. Late-night violation notices slipped under my door, sudden noise complaints about my lawnmower, even an official letter questioning whether my trash bins were stored invisible from the street, per subsection 8.4. Each strike was designed not to break me outright, but to exhaust me, to remind me that resistance was costly. And then she set her sights on my daughter. It started 3 days before the lemonade stand debacle. A thin white envelope arrived, the HOA letterhead stamped across the top. Inside was a community conduct reminder, written in Marlene's meticulous, passive-aggressive style. It warned about unauthorized solicitation and activities that may diminish neighborhood tranquility. I remember laughing bitterly when I read it, because it was so vague it could mean anything. Only later did I realize it was a warning shot. She had already seen the hand-painted "Lemonade, 50 cents" sign my daughter taped to our mailbox. The day of the incident, I told my daughter to set up anyway. I said, "It's your sidewalk, it's our home." Maybe I was reckless. Maybe I wanted a confrontation. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to her that bullies like Marlene don't get to dictate childhood. But Marlene arrived like clockwork. At precisely 9:07 a.m., she marched down the street in her navy blazer, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. She didn't knock. She didn't warn. She just shoved the table aside, sending paper cups tumbling like dominoes. My daughter gasped. I froze, and in that instant, I realized I was staring at the purest form of control, the kind that targets the smallest, the most defenseless, because it knows that's where it hurts most. I confronted her right there on the sidewalk. My voice carried, sharp and unrestrained. "You're terrorizing a child." Her response was ice cold. "I'm enforcing the bylaws. If you have a problem with that, bring it up at the next board meeting." That was Marlene's shield, the bylaws. She wielded them like a medieval sword, selective and absolute. But here's the truth most people don't know. Bylaws have limits. Even in HOA-governed communities, municipalities recognize property owners' rights. Children selling lemonade? Courts have thrown out restrictions like that as unreasonable, unenforceable, even unconstitutional in some cases. Marlene counted on us not knowing, but I did, and in that moment, I decided to use it. That evening, I filed another request. This time, it wasn't just for board meeting minutes. It was for financial records, attorney invoices, and correspondence related to community conduct. By law, the HOA had to provide them within 10 business days. I knew what I was looking for. Evidence of her overreach, paper trails of her unilateral decisions, and maybe even proof that she was spending HOA funds on her own personal vendettas. But the confrontation didn't end there. The next day she came to my door. No letter this time, no clipboard, just Marlene. Her perfume thick like a cloud, her smile saccharine. "I hope we can avoid further misunderstandings," she cooed, though her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "It would be a shame if recurring violations affected your standing in the community." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're not going to threaten my daughter again." Her smile faltered, but only for a second. "I don't threaten, I enforce. There is a difference." And then she turned on her heel and walked away, heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome of menace. That night I sat with my daughter, who asked quietly, "Did I do something wrong?" My chest ached at the question. That's the poison of people like Marlene. They make innocents feel guilty. I told her the truth. "No, you did everything right. She's the one who's wrong. and she's not going to get away with it. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because Marlene wasn't finished. 2 days later, I found another violation notice taped to my door, this one accusing me of endangering neighborhood safety because of traffic congestion caused by the lemonade stand. It was laughable. 3 cars had stopped by, tops. But there it was, in black and white, with a threat of escalating fines if it happened again. She had gone from harassing me to fabricating charges against my child. Do you see the escalation? The pettiness sharpening into cruelty. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. It was about breaking us down, piece by piece. I knew then that Marlene had underestimated me, because while she clung to her clipboard and pearls, I had something stronger, resolve, and a growing paper trail that could one day bury her. That night I made a choice. I wasn't going to wait for her next attack. I was going to start gathering allies, quietly, discreetly. If the neighbors were too afraid to speak in public, maybe they'd speak in whispers. And if enough whispers gathered, maybe they'd form something louder than Marlene's threats. But the road ahead was dangerous. I knew she'd sense resistance like a wolf smells blood. The question wasn't whether she'd retaliate. The question was how. Because if she was willing to target a 10-year-old,
My God,
what line
she's hanging
wouldn't
it
she
from
cross?
the tree. Those were the first words out of my mouth, and I didn't even recognize my own voice. My throat was dry, scraped raw with disbelief, but the words cut across the yard in the stunned silence of 30 neighbors. You ever watch a scene unfold that feels too twisted, too outrageous to belong in real life? That's what this was. The HOA president, Marlene, in her navy blazer and heels, standing at the base of the oak tree in my front yard, looping a thick rope over a branch like she was setting the stage for some kind of public execution. Nobody moved at first. You could feel the paralysis, like everyone was waiting for permission to react. The light from the street lamps burned down on her face, casting sharp shadows across her cheekbones, the rope dangling like a pendulum between her manicured fingers. The smell of cut grass hung in the air, heavy and sickly sweet. I heard one child whimper from across the street. Another whispered, "Mom, what is she doing?" But no parent dared answer. And then it hit me. This wasn't about a tree limb at all. This was about control, punishment, spectacle. She wanted to humiliate me publicly, to turn my so-called violation into a neighborhood morality play. 5 sentences, 6 sentences, rapid, brutal punches of disbelief. The crowd's murmurs rose into a low tide of horror. Someone's phone clicked on, recording. A man's voice muttered, "This is insane." And then the rope swung forward, grazing my daughter's cheek as Marlene ordered in a tone cold enough to freeze blood, "This is what happens when you ignore citations." 3 weeks earlier, it had started with a letter. A thin, cream-colored envelope tucked beneath my door with the HOA insignia embossed at the top. Inside, typed in sterile 12-point font, was a violation notice. Unauthorized exterior ornamentation, removal required within 7 days. The ornamentation in question? A hand-painted swing I'd built for my daughter, secured with sturdy knots to the oak tree out front. A childhood dream, made real in pine and rope. But to Marlene, it wasn't nostalgia, it was an offense. The bylaws, she wrote, clearly prohibited non-uniform exterior displays or unapproved attachments to common or visible landscaping. The oak, she argued, was technically within the community's landscape purview, though it stood squarely on my deeded property. At first, I thought it was just a misunderstanding. I drafted a polite response, citing county parcel maps and HOA Section 4.3.1, which affirmed property lines extending to the sidewalk. I expected dialogue, maybe even compromise. Instead, her next letter was sharper, like a blade pressed against the skin.
daily fines, $50 accruing until compliance, threat of lien if unpaid, and then in italics at the bottom, failure to comply may result in corrective action by the board. That phrase stuck with me like a splinter. Corrective action. The week that followed was a blur of whispers, sidewise glances, and subtle intimidation. Neighbors who once waved began avoiding eye contact. A few even suggested I just take the swing down. It's not worth the fight, they said, as if bowing to tyranny was the price of peace. But I couldn't. That swing was more than wood and rope. It was laughter, scraped knees, and evenings where my daughter's hair caught the golden light of the setting sun. When the deadline passed, the board convened. The hearing was staged in the community hall, fluorescent lights buzzing, metal folding chairs lined in rows. I remember Marlene seated at the front table like a judge in a starched courtroom. "Non-compliance," she declared, tapping her manicured nails against a copy of the bylaws. I argued, presented photos, cited state statutes that protect property owners from overreach. She countered with icy precision, twisting language until black sounded white. The board voted 3-2 against me. Corrective action authorized. Which brings us back to that night under the oak tree. I should have seen it coming, but nothing prepares you for a moment where legality and lunacy collide. Marlene, in front of 30 witnesses, decided corrective action meant more than removing a swing. It meant staging a grotesque display of dominance. She unhooked my daughter's swing from the branch, tied her rope in its place, and let it dangle like a threat. My daughter froze, clutching my arm, her small body trembling against me. "Daddy, is she going to take my swing forever?" Her voice cracked, and I felt my stomach twist. "Step back," I told her, pushing her gently behind me. My pulse hammered. Every muscle screamed to lunge forward, to tear that rope from Marlene's hands. But I knew better. If I crossed that line, she'd win. She'd spin it into aggression, call security, press charges. No, this had to be documented, witnessed, undeniable. So I stood there, fists clenched, letting the neighbors see what she was doing. That's when the scream cut the night open. It wasn't my daughter. It wasn't me. It was one of the neighbors, a woman down the block, phone in hand, shrieking as if she'd just watched a crime. And in a way, she had. Because Marlene, without hesitation, looped the rope into a noose and shouted, "This community will not tolerate defiance!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones went up, recording from every angle. A man's voice yelled, "You're insane!" Another shouted, "Call the cops!" And still Marlene stood firm, the rope swinging under the lamplight like a pendulum counting down to something unspeakable. I stepped forward, just enough for my voice to carry. "You're finished, Marlene. Everyone here sees it. This is harassment, this is intimidation, and it's unlawful corrective action under Section 720.305 of the Florida statutes." I made sure to say the statute aloud, because once those words were on the recordings, they couldn't be erased. Her face flickered, just for a second, a crack in the porcelain mask. But then she recovered, tightening her grip on the rope, eyes glittering with fury. The escalation hit its breaking point when the faint whoop-whoop-whoop of blades echoed overhead. At first I thought it was my pulse pounding in my ears, but the sound grew heavier, louder, until the crowd collectively looked up. A helicopter. Not police. News. Its spotlight cut through the night like a blade of white fire, locking on Marlene and her rope display. The scream that had started the chaos had spread like wildfire through neighborhood group chats, and apparently someone had called the press. The light illuminated everything. The rope, the noose, Marlene's manicured hand, my daughter's terrified face. The neighborhood was no longer frozen. It was awake, alive, witnessing. And yet, no one moved to stop her. Not yet. That night didn't end with resolution. It ended with questions. Would law enforcement step in? Would the HOA collapse under the weight of scandal? Or would Marlene somehow twist the narrative back into her favor? As the rotor wash rustled the trees and neighbors whispered in frantic tones, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about a swing anymore. This was about power and whether an entire community would stand up to it or let itself be strangled by a rope swinging from a tree. And as the helicopter circled above, its light burning down, I couldn't shake one thought from my mind. What would she do next when the cameras
They're not here
weren't
for me.
watching?
They're here for her. That was the thought that cut through the thunder of rotor blades hammering the night sky. You could feel the vibrations in your ribs, the pressure rolling through your chest like a second heartbeat. Oak leaves whipped into spirals across the lawns. Porch lights flickered. Windows rattled in their frames. And there stood Marlene, framed in the glare of the helicopter spotlight, clutching her pearls like they could shield her from what was coming. For a moment, the neighborhood was paralyzed. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We'd all seen HOA drama before. Fines, hearings, threats of liens. But this? Soldiers fast roping down onto our cul-de-sac in full tactical gear? That was something Maplewood had never prepared for. It happened so quickly, the whole block felt like a movie set caught mid-scene. 1 second, Marlene was shouting about community standards, her rope display swinging grotesquely in the light. The next, boots hit the pavement and shouts rang out, firm, authoritative commands that made everyone instinctively back up. Step away from the subject, secure the perimeter. You could almost hear the neighborhood's collective gasp. But let me take you back 3 weeks earlier, because this wasn't just about a swing or even about Marlene's obsession with control. No, this had roots in money, secrecy, and the way power always tries to hide behind paperwork. It started with whispers. The HOA budget reports never added up. Landscaping fees doubled overnight. Community security costs appeared in line items, yet the only guard we ever saw was a bored teenager checking pool passes. And then there were the rumors about Marlene's husband, Richard, a defense contractor supposedly. Always traveling, never seen at neighborhood gatherings, his company's name popping up in local news tied to questionable government bids. I ignored most of it until I found the audit report. The county clerk's office, tucked inside a dull government building with linoleum floors and humming fluorescent lights, had public records most people never thought to request. I did. A Freedom of Information Act filing, a tedious wait, and suddenly I was holding a packet of documents linking Maplewood's HOA accounts to a shell corporation, one that traced directly back to Richard's contracting firm. Landscaping invoices had been funneled into defense expenditures. Our HOA dues, in part, were being laundered through community accounts. At first, it didn't make sense. Why Maplewood? Why our quiet suburban neighborhood of mailboxes and manicured hedges? But that was the genius of it. Nobody questions an HOA budget. Nobody imagines the $200 monthly dues from families scraping by are padding the margins of million-dollar defense deals. I confronted Marlene in private once before the chaos with the rope. I'll never forget her smile. Cold, controlled, like I'd just been added to a list. She said, "Be very careful where you go digging. HOA authority extends farther than you think." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. So when the night of the rope display was different, she wasn't just trying to humiliate me, she was sending a warning to the entire block. Step out of line, challenge her authority, and you'd be made an example of. What she didn't anticipate was how public it would become. Cell phones capturing every second, a neighbor's cousin forwarding the footage to a local reporter, at a reporter, passing it straight to federal investigators who'd been circling her husband for months. So when those helicopters roared in over Maplewood, it wasn't the swing they were after. It was the paper trail, the embezzlement, the way Richard and Marlene had twisted HOA bylaws into weapons, both petty and financial. The soldiers moved with precision. Two secured the rope, pulling it down in one clean motion, the noose falling harmlessly into the grass. Another waved me and my daughter back toward our porch. "You're safe now," he said firmly, eyes scanning the crowd. And then, at all once, the spotlight cut sharper, pinning Marlene in its glare. "Marlene Whitaker," a voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Step forward, hands visible. You are under investigation for federal financial crimes and conspiracy." Her composure cracked. She shook her head violently, shouting over the wind, "This is outrageous! I'm the president of this community! I demand you leave this property immediately!" Her voice was swallowed by the helicopter's roar. Neighbors exchanged looks, half shock, half relief. After years of watching her wield the bylaws like a cudgel, they were finally seeing her cornered. I'll never forget the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement as she backed away, pearls trembling between her fingers. "This is private jurisdiction," she screeched, invoking the HOA's limited power as if it could repel the United States Army. But the soldiers didn't even flinch. They moved in tighter, forming a wall of calm authority. And then came the moment. Handcuffs. Cold, unmistakable steel gleaming under the spotlight. The gasp that went through Maplewood was almost audible. Over the helicopter, people who had once cowered at her violation letters now whispered in disbelief, phones raised high to capture every angle. A neighbor muttered near me, "Every fine I ever paid better come back with interest." Another chuckled bitterly, "Guess the Queen finally lost her crown." My daughter squeezed my hand tighter, her eyes wide but steady. "Daddy," she whispered, "does this mean I get my swing back?" That question cut deeper than any legal revelation, because in that moment, amidst helicopters and federal warrants, what mattered was something small and human. A little girl's swing. The soldiers didn't answer questions. They secured Marlene in a waiting vehicle, her voice still shrieking about bylaws and authority as if she could filibuster her way out of handcuffs. Richard wasn't there. Rumor had it he'd already been detained at an airport hours earlier. But the sight of Marlene, the tyrant of Maplewood, shoved into the back of a black SUV under floodlights was enough. After they left, the cul-de-sac looked like a battlefield. Lawns littered with fallen leaves, ropes tangled on the ground, neighbors standing in clumps whispering in tones equal parts fear and exhilaration. Nobody knew what would happen next. Would the HOA dissolve? Would the fines be refunded? Would we finally be free to live without surveillance and citations for mailbox paint colors? I stood on my porch, the swing rope still clutched in my hand, and asked myself something that made my stomach twist. If Marlene had built her empire on intimidation and fraud, who else had been complicit? Were other board members in on it? Were we just pawns in a larger scheme that stretched far beyond Maplewood? The helicopters faded into the distance, leaving behind only the faint smell of exhaust and the echo of something broken. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter, unchained. But that freedom carried a shadow, because when corruption unravels, it rarely ends cleanly. And as neighbors whispered about refunds and revenge, I couldn't shake the chilling truth. Marlene might be gone, but the system that enabled her, the bylaws, the board, the obsession with control, was still here. So I have to ask you, was this truly the end of Marlene's reign, or just the beginning of something darker waiting to take her place?